Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to my podcast, The Movement We Need, in which I explore movement building from many different directions. This started as a kind of companion to the series I've been writing on Substack called The Movement We Need, looking at how our social movements and political movements can do a better job of meeting some of our core human needs, like safety, belonging, being seen and valued, having a sense of agency and impact, and meaning and purpose. And I'm still writing that series. I'm working now on the last chapter. But in the meantime, the podcast has ranged to a lot of the other aspects of movement building. And one of them that I've been involved in for many years is permaculture, or in a broader sense, the idea of regenerative design. How do we not just protest about protecting the earth and not just sing and chant and do rituals about healing the earth, but where do we actually get the practical knowledge and the skills and the understandings that we need to create regenerative systems? So today I've invited my chief teaching partner, Charles Williams, good friend, buddy, and co-director of Earth Activist Training, on here to have a little conversation about permaculture, what it means, and particularly what are some of the solutions and the approaches we can offer in a time of climate chaos and multiple system breakdown. So, hello, Charles. Want to say hello and introduce yourself a bit?
Hello, everybody. My name's Charles Williams. I'm with Earth Actors Training, and I've been following Star around for decades now. She's drugged me all over the world into different places, got me in some trouble here and there, but we've also been doing an incredible amount of permaculture over the years, both designing and installing things, and also doing a lot of teaching. So I'm excited to be here and talk about permaculture and solutions.
Thanks, Charles. I will say that Charles was my land partner for about 6 years here up on the ranch, and I miss having him here so much because one of Charles's great superpowers is he has an amazing talent for physical reality. Like, things work for him, you know? Things that are supposed to work actually work. Whereas for me, and I think for many of us, things that are supposed to work sometimes do and often don't. Uh, and permaculture in practice is a lot about dealing with physical reality. But more than that, it's really a system of design. It's the idea that if we apply our human intelligence and creativity, and if we observe and look at the world and understand how nature functions, we can actually design systems that will meet our human needs while regenerating the environment around us. And that includes our physical needs, but more and more permaculture has been expanding to include some of our emotional needs as well. So permaculture starts off as an ethical system. It has 3 core ethics that guide our behavior. And in that way, it's different from many other design systems that don't necessarily start with an ethic. They may start with an aesthetic. So, Charles, maybe you'd like to speak to those ethics.
Sure. The three ethics that permaculture is rooted in is care of the earth, which is the goal to really have what we do support the earth. It's regeneration, it's continued function. Many of our systems are degraded. So in permaculture design, we try to improve the natural world. Um, because of the degradation that's happened over time. So we're always looking at how do we kind of end up with a system that is ecologically sound. There's care of people. So all of our designs have to care for people. And when we talk about care for people in permaculture, we're talking about people's personal needs to um, exist in a healthy way. We're talking about good food and space and agency. We're talking about people being able to be safe and valued. So those are the type of things when we talk about care of people. So like, how do we design a system that cares for the earth and provides for human needs in a way that really respects and takes care of people, and not some narrow slice of people or one demographic of people, but like all people. So if we grow healthy food is good for everybody, not just for some people. If we're able to harvest rainwater to have clean drinking water is good for everybody, right? So we have care of people, we have care of the earth, and then the third one is phrased a few different ways. Care of the future, fair share, but this idea that whatever our designs are, that it looks into the future, and then it's not going to just take care of us here now in this exact moment. It's not greedy in that way. It really thinks about the future and like, how do we take care of the things that come next, and how do we, instead of hoarding any one thing for us right now, that we're always taking any surplus we have and reinvesting it for the good of the whole system. So those are our three values. And if it doesn't, if those values aren't expressed in our designs, it's probably not a permaculture design. It might be interesting, it might be aesthetically cool, but it might not fit into permaculture head.
Yeah, I think a lot about that third one. Sometimes they're expressed as earth care, people care, fair share. And that ethic actually runs so counter to our current capitalist system, where the idea is not to reinvest profit back into the system and to improving its viability and sustainability and health. The idea is to extract value and take it away and give it to somebody else or hoard it up, and how it might really change the way we do so many things, from economics to our social structures to our governmental structures, if fair share were the core value of our civilization. We would not have, billionaires. What is it? Something like the top 1% owning something like 50% of all the wealth in the United States right now. This tremendous disparity and inequality, which then creates resentment and anger and rage and instability. Uh, Instead, um, everyone would understand this principle of reciprocity. It runs both through permaculture and also through a lot of indigenous cultures. I'm always wary about saying like indigenous culture as if it were one thing, because there are thousands of different indigenous cultures around the world today, tens of thousands that have existed since the beginning of time. And they're all different and they have different values, but there is a common thread that I think is shared among many, many different peoples that live close to the earth. And that is this understanding that the world has to be in balance, that what you take, you have to give back. So I have been working on my chapter on meaning. As part of that, I've been rereading a wonderful book I recommend to everyone. It's called Sand Talk by Tyson Yungaporta, who's an Australian Aboriginal, who's really looking at the subtitle is How Indigenous Thinking Could Save the World. How do we bring an indigenous worldview into our culture and our civilization? And one of the things he talks about is this principle of reciprocity, that you can't just take and take and take, that you are obligated to give back because that's what keeps everything in balance. And if things are not in balance, then they're not stable. They're not going to survive. There have been some critiques of permaculture saying, oh, this is just repackaged indigenous knowledge. And I think that's actually unfair to permaculture. It's not, it's actually something quite different from pure traditional ecological knowledge. But permaculture does draw on that and does give credit and homage to indigenous wisdom and traditional wisdom. And I think there's a way in which a kind of indigenous understanding and sensibility infuses the practice of permaculture.
Yeah, I think there's no way to, to talk about having long and cultures, like creating a permanent culture, without realizing that there's some very long-lived cultures out there, and to
Mhm.
really look at those and say, what can we learn? But what are some of the themes? But because permaculture isn't place-based, it doesn't really fit as an indigenous technology. Like, all tribes are from a place, like, oh, you do this in the season when this flowers, or you like indigenous cultures are rich and deep. They have music, they have rituals, they have uh, clothing and art styles. Like they have craft, like they have all these things that make them rich. And I would say permaculture is more of a generalist to say what are some of the themes that we see in the world that creates for resilience over time. And of course, there's no way to talk about those without acknowledging that there are cultures that have existed for very long periods of time. But also, it's very different when you apply something globally than if you apply something specifically. And I think there's a real distinct difference between the two.
I think one thing we forget is that, most of us are probably not indigenous to where we are right now. We come out of a culture that's very transitory and migratory and disconnected. But all of us have ancestors that were indigenous somewhere, someplace, for far, far longer than civilization has existed. They've just discovered a site, I think, in Dorset in England that shows that human beings have been able to make fire deliberately for something like 800,000 years. Yeah. Previously, we apparently were using fire for 1.5 million, long before we were in our current Homo sapiens, incarnation. But to actually make fire, and I don't know if any of you have ever tried to make fire without matches, like with flint and steel or with a bow drill. It's not easy to do, right? It's, like it really requires some skill and practice and experience. And I often wonder how the hell somebody came up with this for the very first time. Um, you know, apparently by striking flint and iron pyrites, which will produce a spark. But still, it's an amazing feat to be able to do that. And I think we have to honor that we have an evolutionary history that puts us in connection to the earth and to natural systems. And again, that is far, far older and far, far longer than our history of civilization, and certainly than our history of spending a lot of time doom scrolling on our cell phones, not getting out of the house much. I know, Charles, you've spent a lot of time in the wilderness, and I wonder if you could speak to how that connection to nature uh, infuses what you do with permaculture?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure where it doesn't infuse. I spent a lot of time in my younger years romping around in the wilderness, some in the close wilderness, close to peoples, and other ones in kind of remote, far away wilderness. And in all of those, I found a deep love for wild places, for the creatures that live there and the pace of life, like the pace of the natural world, and had the rhythms of the seasons and the rhythms of the day. And it really matched. Like when I was able to, there's a piece around like going into the wild. If you go in for a hike in a day, you can have this great feeling, but as you spend more time, if you spend a whole moon cycle, a whole, kind of month out, your kind of you re-regulate to kind of the natural rhythms. And I loved that place. And I loved seeing everything that came out when you were quiet and still and how the world came alive. And really wanted to preserve that. Like I really come from a preservation background. And then coming back into the front country, really realizing that preservation is a lofty goal, and conserving spaces is important. And permaculture is a really good way to do that. It's a really good way in which to say, okay, how do we live in these cycles of the natural world, but also realize that humans need to live somewhere. Like to preserve wild spaces, then we have to answer the question: where do people live? And if people live somewhere, how do we live in such a way that we can leave places for the wild, that we can inhabit places that is not um, deep wild places and places that are not urban, but you have this kind of in between the rural places. And those can be very, very lively and they're very important for the natural world. So my time in the wild is what kind of moved me into the permaculture world because I want to find a solution. Like, how do we live well so the things I love can continue to live, and we can create spaces? And the more I learn, the more I realize that it isn't this or that, but we can design so that wild spaces exist and humans exist and creatures have space. And we don't have to destroy large swaths of wild places, and we can reforest and rewild and still have a good life. Like we don't have to like go live in the Stone Age, because I look at my family, and if I were to say, "Oh yeah, let's go back to living," you know, like they did, my family would be like, absolutely not. I like my comforts, and I think we can have many of those things that we in modern society value, um, and still regenerate the world, the
Mhm.
natural world and our ecological world, and we have to. If we're going to exist as humans, we have to. So finding that balance. So my love of the wild moved me into permaculture, and the more time I spend there, the more I realize that we can design a world where we really can live well as humans, and the natural world can exist and have its space and have its own autonomy.
And that's one thing I really like about permaculture. I've been an environmentalist all of my life, pretty much. I didn't get to spend as much time in the wilderness as you did. I grew up kind of as a city girl, a suburban girl. I always would have loved to go camping and that, but my family, my mother was a single mom and um, didn't know from any of that. So it wasn't until I got to be a teenager and kind of left home that I could spend time in the wild. And now that I'm older and am suffering from the limitations of age and the body, I wish I'd spent more time when I was younger and fitter. But what I do like about permaculture is, many environmentalists seem to have this idea that people are inevitably the problem. And no matter what we do, we're going to mess things up and make them worse. And, we're kind of a blight on the planet, and she'd be better off without us. And that, I think, is not a philosophy that you can actually organize people around. It's hard to get people excited and mobilized around the idea that they shouldn't exist. Um, and it's not really an idea that's going to help us in repairing and regenerating ecosystems. So permaculture is much more optimistic. It says that yes, we actually can as human beings, if we observe, if we let nature be our teacher, then we actually can understand how we can work with nature and be, I like to say, nature's healing hands and appreciative heart and open-eyed, wondering eyes. That nature really likes to be admired. And it's part of our job as humans is to go around saying like, whoa, how beautiful that is. And, wow, look at that redwood tree. I mean, I'm looking up at one that must be like over 100 feet tall, right? How does this thing just take air and water and sunlight and grow into this giant thing? Isn't this an amazing and miraculous world with incredible miracles all around us? Uh, that was another thing in Junga Porta's book in Sand Talk. He talks about, the purpose of humans is to be a custodial species. We're supposed to be taking care of what's around us, both physically and also spiritually. Uh, So to do that, there are certain, you could say, guides in permaculture. We call them principles. They're not exactly rules, but they're sort of, rules of thumb or guidance to how you approach systems. And um, there's different formulations of them. Permaculture was started by two Australians, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, and they each have their own formulations of the principles. But I wonder if you have a couple favorites you'd like to talk about, or ones that you think might really help guide us in this moment when so many terrible things are constantly happening around the world and the life support systems of the earth herself are challenged in so many ways.
There's so many that it could speak to. The one that's striking me today more than any other is use on-site resources. So I'm here in a city. I live in an apartment. I used to live kind of rural. And there's lots, but I live here now. And like, oh, one of the permaculture principles is on-site resources. How can we use local resources? And this is recycling and repurposing. It's the amazing thrift stores here. Like, we just came through Christmas. Like, how much new unnecessary things kind of came across my awareness that I didn't even know somebody would need. Like, that thing exists because somebody really needs that plastic, that thing. Like, really? Like, but can we use on-site resources? Can we use local resources to meet our needs? And that means like food, that's supplies for building, like local building materials versus far away. Right now, with what's going on in the news, the like on-site resources versus going somewhere else and taking their resources is really alive for me. I don't think that we either individually or collectively need to be like going around and like taking resources from places that we might be able to get our needs met using our local resources. And we've seen just a lot of imperial damage done with this idea that to exist, we need to exploit things far, far away. So the question is, what can we do for on-site? What can we use for local resources? There's a lot of local resources that we all have access to, whether individually or collectively. So that one's really alive for me right now.
Thanks. Yeah. One that I've been thinking about a lot is the principle that diversity generates resilience, and that when we create systems, we try to make them diverse. If we're planting a garden, we don't just plant one thing, we plant multiple plants and, encourage wildlife or birds or animals or beneficial insects. We put things together in ways that they support each other. And I think in our overarching culture right now, we're this point where, let's just say certain factions are trying to paint diversity as a threat and a problem. That we want to get rid of everybody here in the US who doesn't look a certain way, and that will make our country, quote, great again. And actually, what you do when you eliminate diversity is you eliminate your resilience. You make yourself less intelligent as a system because that diversity, looking at people, that diversity of life experience, of heritage, of culture gives you a wider spectrum of ways that you can respond to a challenge or a crisis. So it's a tremendous gift. And trying to eliminate it is one of the stupidest things we can do. And I also think a lot, probably my favorite quote from Bill Mollison is that evil is stupidity rigorously applied. That applies, I think, every single day reading the news. I think about that definition. Do you have another principle?
Let's see. Um, Also, what's living for me today is least change for the greatest effect.
Mm,
And that principle is one, as I get older and learn more, is really, really useful. Like, what can we do to really make a big difference? And sometimes little things, if we pick the right little thing, we can make a huge difference. And it doesn't take these like sweeping, gigantic activities. What is it to, when COVID happened? There's a lot of community mutual aid that happened. Like people
mhm,
are like, oh, we need to help each other, and little things, oh, somebody made a few masks and passed them out. Other people were, doing all these little things that made huge differences, and then, kind of modern life takes over again, and people are busy and they go away. But it's those little differences that really made it so that many, many people who would have struggled otherwise were successful, kind of
mhm,
coming through it. It's when we look at things like climate change, which are going to require some big solutions. There's no doubt about it. Like it is a global problem needing some global solutions, but there's some really small solutions, like simple solutions that we can do that can make a big difference around like how do we use our water, how do we generate our energy, just turning off our lights, like having whole regimes so that
mhm,
we think about and collectively organize around how do we not use more energy than we need. These little changes have a great effect. So, like looking for those places in any design or any system where you're like, oh, we can do a little change versus, calling in like the massive troops to like go
mhm,
and like raid. Like, there are probably simpler and more effective ways to meet people's needs. So, like, least change for the greatest effect. What can
mhm.
we do? Small things that make big impacts versus big showy things just to big and showy.
Yeah, that principle I always think of also as a good one for strategy. Danella Meadows, who is the wonderful systems thinker, talks about the trim tabs. Like on an airplane, there's these little flaps, and if you adjust them, it changes the whole direction of the plane as it's flying. And she says, look for the trim tabs, look for the small things you can do that are going to have a big impact. Do you remember that time we got asked to do a permaculture consult for that group of Buddhist nuns?
Yes, I do.
That they're a contemplative community up here in the hills, and they live like I am miles away from everywhere, behind a locked gate for their overall, the whole development they're part of, up massive dirt roads and just, it's not a place anyone's ever gonna encounter by accident, and, they belong to a particular sect of Buddhism where they're not allowed to eat anything unless someone offers it to them and prepares it for them, which sent me into an immediate existential panic. Just at the very thought, but also like not doing that in, a crowded city in India where everybody culturally understands you're supposed to offer food to beggars, but doing it when you're way up in the mountains, behind a locked gate, no one's going to get there. But uh, I think our consult, they were worried about their water supply and about making sure it was safe to drink. And they were having trouble with their water filter. And somebody had suggested they drill a well, which would have cost tens of thousands of dollars. And in our area isn't really a very good idea because there's no aquifers. There's only these perched springs, and you punch a hole into where the springs are, and you can punch through the layer that holds them up and drain them and drain other people's springs. Um, and you remember what our solution was for them?
We had a number. Which one are you thinking of?
Well, I'm just thinking about like saying, look, you've got beautiful, clean water here
Mhm.
that's coming from rain and coming from pristine springs. You don't need to worry about taking a shower in this water or using it to wash your dishes, or even drinking water that you boil. The only thing you need to worry about is just drinking it, without any treatment. So why don't you just get a little tabletop water filter big enough so you can filter the water you need to drink and not worry about the rest of it? And that probably might cost them maybe $100 if they invest in a good pre-made one, as opposed to $10,000. And to me, that's a great example of least change for the greatest effect. So, um, you mentioned climate change, and I think permaculture to me is one of the approaches we need to deal with climate change because climate change isn't just the carbon numbers, it's about the degradation of ecosystems across the planet. And if you think of it in that way, then the solution is about regenerating ecosystems. And that's one of the things I think permaculture is good at. Um, do you want to speak about how permaculture might impact our approach to climate?
Sure. Yeah. So climate change, um, you know, is this danger that we face. It's happening. Things are getting warmer, and um, we need to figure out what to do. There's all these competing suggestions. From shooting mirrors into space or creating big factories that suck CO2 out of the air and produce this kind of toxic waste that you had to push back into the earth to get more oil out. There's type of solutions, but we have some really really good ones that um, are ecological, that are safe, that are well known. Things like planting more trees.
Mhm.
And a lot of the permaculture solutions to climate change need to be done at a scale. Like we need to do them on both small scale, and this might be, in your backyard and in your city, doing reforestation or growing food locally, and so it doesn't have to be shipped, things like that. Some of it has to be done on larger scales, but there's very little downside. Like when you think about creating an industrial factory to suck CO2 out of the air, it requires a huge amount of electricity. It takes a lot of water, but reforestation, well, you have it helps clean water to begin with. It creates habitat. Habitat loss is is another thing we're facing, and it's been less in the news, but really growing, is like the loss of habitat, is equally devastating as climate changes. So, and species loss. So, a lot of the permaculture solutions, they don't have these big negative downsides. Putting mirrors into space so we get less
Mhm.
solar energy from the sun. Like all of our food grows with that solar energy. The idea that we're going to reduce it and then continue to produce food on scale, like there's just some real dangers to that. So there's a lot of solutions that permaculture has. The nice thing about them is they're ecologically engaged, so there isn't kind of toxic downsides that you often find with industrial solutions. And this is things like growing local food locally, it's composting, it's biochar, it's reforestation, it's silvopasturing, it's grazing systems that are ecologically engaged. These are the type of things that are going to make the biggest difference. And that's where I think permaculture really has a role to play, is looking at these ecological systems and how do we design whole systems to support global health versus, these industrial ones, which are kind of a mix between money makers and like short term um, patches to a
Mm.
problem.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the great revelations was understanding how when we do the things we need to do to build healthy soil, we are actually drawing carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it, putting it into the soil as humus, as soil organic carbon. So we can not only do we need to stop pumping CO2 into the atmosphere with using up oil and fossil fuels, but we actually do have the capacity to start drawing it down if we were to engage in, a massive soil building strategies uh, globally. And the wonderful thing is, those are things that are actually going to do a lot of other good. They're going to uh, create healthier soil for growing things in. We're going to have food that's more nutrient rich and nutrient dense if it's grown in living soil. It means switching to systems that are low till or no till instead of constantly plowing up the earth, and that's going to reduce erosion. Living healthy soil is also able to hold on to water better. So it's going to reduce some of the impacts of, these storms and floods and things that climate change is exacerbating by helping us um, hold water in the land and in the landscape more effectively. The grazing systems that you were mentioning allow people to grow more animals in, humane and healthy ways, and actually regenerate grasslands, which actually need grazers in order to be healthy. That's how they co-evolved. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And, there is a researcher, Dr. Ratan Lal, at the University of Ohio Soil Carbon Institute, who says we have as much excess carbon in the atmosphere from the Dust Bowl in the 1930s as from every automobile ever invented, which is, astounding when you think about it, from the erosion and the soil blowing away and the oxidizing of that humus that keeps the soil fertile. Um, and bigger than that, from 10,000 years of agriculture, um, we've mined the soils, and that means that we have an opportunity there. One of the other permaculture principles I really like is one that says the problem is the solution. Uh, I always say, I'm not sure that's always true, but it always makes you think about the situation more creatively. And if the problem is degraded soil, then the solution is regenerating that soil is also going to help rebalance the carbon in the atmosphere. And again, I think as if our purpose as humans is to be caretakers of the earth and healers, then to me that's a very noble undertaking. How do we actually, literally heal some of the soil under our feet?
I think I'd like to add that the solutions that we're talking about, the permaculture solutions, are
Mhm,
ones that can be applied across the planet and equitably. Like, they're not only for rich countries. There are some really good solutions
mhm,
that are technologically advanced and are expensive,
mhm.
and those will benefit the people who can afford them. So we're talking about kind of rich Western countries, and I think our solutions really have to be equitable on a global scale. Like, people can reforest areas, they can do restorative grazing across the planet. Like, this is, people have been grazing across the planet. People have been growing
Mhm.
trees all over. Like, if your ecology supports trees, if your ecology supports grazing, like, this can be done, and it's not hard technology that requires a huge kind of industrial level investment. So it also, in that people care aspect, I think our solutions are also kind of these local, human scaled, human engaged, you know, systems, versus these kind of corporate scale, centralized power systems that are often talked about as being the only solutions. So I think permaculture offers that too, that we have this scale difference how we approach our solutions.
Yeah, and I think it's especially hopeful because it's something anyone can do either on an individual scale or on a larger scale if you organize your community or your kid's school or your local city council around some of these solutions. It can build up into larger scale uh, approaches as well. For me, that's partly why I feel like permaculture education is so important and why we started Earth Activist Training, which is our organization that teaches permaculture design with a grounding in spirit and focus on organizing and activism. Um, and Penny Livingston and I started it in 2000 after we came back from a big blockade in Seattle against the World Trade Organization. And we were saying, there's all these amazing young activists, but a lot of them don't know what the solutions are. And there's all these amazing permaculturalists, but a lot of them seem a little unclear about the power structures that are in the way of these solutions. How do we bring that together? And then Charles has been teaching with us for I don't know how many years, a lot of them, right? As
Many.
Penny went on to do other things. And we teach, there's a permaculture design course that's kind of a standard curriculum across the world that's like your entry point into being a permaculture practitioner. And we do teach those courses both in person and online. But I think one of the things we've done with Earth Activist Training is to actually develop some more advanced permaculture programs and um, some other courses that relate to permaculture in different ways that maybe you'd like to speak about, Charles.
Sure. So in the permaculture kind of design course, they touch on all these little topics, and we've really dedicated some time to expanding out on those. So we have a whole sets of courses on how do we live and work together in groups. How do we facilitate meetings? How do we do the social organizing that's necessary to make the change we want in the world? So this is the empowering collaborative groups and the fivefold path to productive meetings. Like we have a number of courses that also talk about business. Like if we're going to um, do permaculture in the world we live in right now, like how do we do it in a way that's both socially and ecologically responsible as a business? Like how do we um, you know, organize our finances and our energy in a way that allows us to feed ourselves and our families and our communities. So we have some classes that really focus on like how do we apply permaculture and ethical business. We have classes that really go into the deep ecology of permaculture and the deep practice of designing with it. Maybe you want to become a landscape designer, or maybe you want to do focused types of designs, maybe in water catchment, or maybe on soil development. Like we have some classes that really help people delve into the areas they're really excited about. We have a diploma program. It's a multi-year program for people who want to get really into permaculture and design and regenerative land practices. And then we have a whole set on disaster response and management. Like we're facing some massive fires and floods and disturbances that both ecologically and socially. And like, how do we design for that? How do we, when we think about creating our spaces and our communities, like how do we in the design of that, in the building of these spaces, how do we get ready for if there's going to be a flood or a fire or a tornado or social disturbance or political unrest? So we have a wide range of courses to help people move into the aspect of permaculture that most fits their interest and skills.
Yeah, and upcoming, we have a whole advanced permaculture program online that you can take as it's a 9-month program divided into several different modules. And if you want to take the whole program, it starts in a couple of weeks with a module on design. To do that, you should really already have your permaculture design certificate. And then you can also take any of the modules on a standalone basis. So the next upcoming one will be on water management. Then we have one on soil and animals, and finally one on forestry, agroforestry, food forests. So again, you could take them all. And if you're interested in our multi-year diploma program, you'll want to take them all eventually, or you could take any one at any given time. And all of this is at earthactivisttraining.org. We'll put that in the show notes as well. So I think we're at about the end of our time, but I could talk to you for hours, days, weeks, months, years, and maybe we will carry on this conversation at some future time again. But I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for all the things that you do to take care of the earth and take care of the people and take care of our future.
Oh, thank you, Star. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being here.